Hello and welcome to the weekly seminar, Viewing Multidimensional Poverty from Many Angles. I'm James Foster, co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, in the Elliott School of International Affairs of the George Washington University. I'm joined by my colleague Sabina Alkire, director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, in Oxford's Department of International Development. We're pleased you've joined us for today's talk, Inequality Among the Multidimensionally Poor in Over 100 Countries, presented by my student, Maria Emma Santos of Universidad Nacional del Sur in Argentina. This is the seventh in a series co-sponsored by IIEP, OPHI, and the Human Development Report Office, or HDRO, of the United Nations Development Program. I'd like to express my appreciation to these partners and to the many benefactors of IIEP for continued support that makes events like these possible. Our discussants today are Heriberto Tapia of HDRO and Hector Moreno of OPHI. In a moment, I'll turn the mic over to Sabina to set the stage and introduce today's speakers. But first, a few words about our institute. IIEP supports research, enhances teaching and learning, and convenes nonpartisan discussions of the key questions facing the international community. Last week on Friday, our Envisioning India series welcomed Kaushik Basu, Mahendra Dev, and Sudha Narayanan for a remarkable discussion of India's farm laws. While next week we welcome N.K. Singh, chair of the 15th Finance Commission of India, who will discuss India's federal finances in COVID times, with commentary by Junaid Ahmad and Indira Rajaraman. On the 4th of March, our China conference continues with a discussion of China's outward investments, state capitalism or capital flight, by Meg Rithmir of Harvard Business School. In case you miss any of our events, you can watch them asynchronously on our YouTube channel, IIEP GW. Now, the present series brings scholars together from around the world to discuss the problem of global poverty viewed multidimensionally. Last week, Rizwan Ul-Haq presented work on mixed analyses of individual and household deprivations, with special emphasis on child poverty and gender analysis. Next week, my student Suman Seth will present Multidimensional Poverty and Inclusive Growth in India, an analysis using growth elasticities. I might just interject here a few words about our speaker. I first met Maria Emma Santos when she was an undergrad student, presenting a paper at a conference hosted by Luis Felipe López Calva in Puebla, Mexico. Before long, she was at Vanderbilt in the master's program I was running, doing better than most of our PhD students. She returned home to Argentina, where I was proud to co-chair her thesis and write a cool paper with her on chronic poverty. And the title of the paper she was presenting then, as an undergraduate? Poverty, Spatial Inequality in Argentina. Seems that things change and stay the same. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Sabina Alkire to introduce the series and our guests. Sabina.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you all for joining us. I think that this will be a very valuable exchange. Mariema also spent time at OPHI, and while she was there, she developed the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index that we co-designed with UNDP, and she led the development of that from the OPHI side in 2009 and 10. And she's continued to work with OPHI since she went back to Bahía Blanca, where she's an assistant professor in the Investigaciones Económicas y Sociales del Sur in Bahía Blanca. She has remained a research associate with OPHI and a very valuable colleague with us. She also co-authored a book with James Foster, with Suman Seth, who is presenting next week on the methodologies of multidimensional poverty measurement. So we're really looking forward to this presentation, and she'll give you the background to it. But I think it's really trying to understand how to interpret inequality among the poor. Heriberto Tapia has been at UNDP and at ECLAC in Latin America. And he has a PhD in economics also from Columbia University. Moreno is a research officer at OPHI, and he reached team in building official national statistics of multidimensional poverty in Asia and Latin America. And before, he was at HDRO in UNDP Mexico, and he's studied at and received his doctorate in France. From the Paris School of Economics. So it's quite a diverse group, and Hector also was at UNDP when Mexico launched its official national MPI. So these are our speakers today, with Emma presenting the paper and Heriberto and Hector commenting, and we are really looking forward to their exchange. Thank you so very much. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind words presenting me. Well, let me share a screen and so that we get started. Let me say that this is joint work with Sabina Alkire, and let me also clarify that it's very much work in progress. So critiques, comments, suggestions are extremely welcome. Inequality has been a matter of great interest for a long time, both for intrinsic reasons as well as instrumental ones, because it has interconnections with development, with economic growth, with political stability and poverty. The measurement of inequality has been mostly centered on income inequality, and a solid body of literature has been developed upon the seminal paper of Atkins in 1970. And a consensus emerged on the properties that income poverty measures should satisfy. Now, what happens if we go beyond income? Well, inequalities in basic capabilities linked to the most extreme deprivations, such as life expectancy at birth, are shrinking. But gaps remain unacceptably wide for a range of capabilities, and the new gaps are also opening in enhanced capabilities, such as life expectancy at older ages. The concern for inequality is reflected in the 2030 Development Agenda, International Development Agenda, in two ways. First, there is an SDG 10, on reducing inequality, but also there is the Leave No One Behind pledge, which is embedded in the whole 2030 Agenda, and specifically in the first SDG on ending poverty in all its forms everywhere, with the explicit target of halving multidimensional poverty. So this paper focuses on one form of inequality, which, as compared to mainstream study of inequality, is narrower, because it looks at inequality among the group of poor people, and it looks at inequality within countries. But at the same time is broader, because it looks at the multidimensionally poor. It means that we're looking at the joint distribution of deprivations as measured by the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, which, as you know, is an index of acute poverty for developing countries, which covers 3 dimensions: health, education, and living standard, and contains 10 indicators, which are equally weighted in a nested way. Each dimension weights a third, and then the weight is equally shared within dimensions. This measure, the MPI, has proven to be a very useful tool for monitoring poverty and informing policy by no coincidence. It is because it has the mathematical structure of the M0 measure, which is one of the measures of the Alkire and Foster's family of multidimensional poverty measures. And thus it satisfies a set of convenient properties which have made it very useful. But it is precisely because of some of these convenient properties that the MPI cannot satisfy other convenient properties, specifically sensitivity to different forms of inequality among the multidimensionally poor. And on that grounds, it has received a number of critiques. But why does it matter to look at inequality among the poor? Well, this is crucially important precisely to fulfill the Leave No One Behind pledge. And this is particularly key for policy purposes. Very frequently, policies towards poverty reduction do not reach precisely the poorest poor, because they are at the crossroads of marginalized groups. They live in very remote rural areas, or they are not well informed of the existence of certain social benefits or programs, or they do not know how to access them, or even if they access them, they do not remain. And we have evidence on these, on the poorest poor dropping from after-school programs, dropping from early childhood protection programs, or not being fully reached by microcredit programs, among other things. So this paper looks at inequality among the multidimensionally poor according to the G-MPI, using two alternative approaches that have been proposed to enlarge this measure. Let me start with an example, which would be, I think, helpful to look at different things and to have a sense of reality of what we are talking about. This is obviously a toy example of a society of 8 people. And we have here 10 indicators, the 10 MPI indicators. We have nutrition, child mortality, years of education, school attendance, cooking fuel, sanitation, water, electricity, floor, and assets. Whenever there is a number there, it signals that there is a deprivation, and the number is the weight that deprivation receives. Whenever there is a 0, it means that there is no deprivation. In this society, we've got 4 people who are non-poor. And that's why they have all zeros. Maybe they have 1 deprivation, but the thing is that the MPI identifies as multidimensionally poor those who have a deprivation score of 33.33% of the weighted deprivation. So maybe they have a deprivation, but they do not reach that minimum, so those deprivations are censored, and we have zeros here. And then we have the first 4 people who are poor, and here you can see the censored deprivation score, which is simply the sum of these scores. And so we have a person who is deprived in everything with a deprivation score of 100%, another person who is deprived in 78% of the weighted indicators, another one with 72%, and another one with 44%. And so the MPI, first let me say the incidence of multidimensional poverty in this society is half of the population is multidimensionally poor. We can also see that on average, the poor are deprived in 73.6 of the weighted deprivations, which is the average of the deprivation scores among the poor, the average of these 4 numbers. And so the MPI is incidence times intensity, which is called the adjusted incidence. And we see that this is an MPI of 36.8%. The MPI satisfies 4 convenient properties. One is dimensional monotonicity, which means that if a poor person becomes deprived in an additional indicator and 0 increases, a property that is not satisfied by the headcount ratio. And we see this with a simple example. If the third person now becomes deprived in assets, her deprivation score increases, and thus, although the incidence doesn't change, intensity does, and so does MPI. There's also the property of subgroup decomposability, which means that if we know that person 1, 2, 5, and 6 belong to, say, a rural area, although they represent half of the population, they contribute with 60% to overall poverty. And that is helpful for a policy, from a policy perspective. And also, very importantly, it allows what is called dimensional breakdown, which means that we can also break down this matrix vertically. And so we can see the censored headcount ratios, which are the proportion of people who are poor and deprived in each indicator. And so we see, for example, that deprivations in years of education contributes with 23% to total poverty, whereas child mortality and deprivation in children's school attendance contributes to 17%. And you also get dimensional contributions, and that is also very relevant for policy. Finally, it satisfies ordinality, which means that it doesn't matter if you change the coding of sanitation or access to water or whatever, the poverty value will not change. So those are the scope and the good things about the MPI, which have made it a very powerful tool. Now let's look at the limitations. there are two forms of inequality properties, and each of these can have a weak version and a strong version. A weak version requires poverty not to change under a certain transformation, and a strong version requires poverty to either increase or decrease under a certain transformation. One of these two properties is the transfer among the poor, which entails smoothing achievements among the poor, something that was introduced by Colm. But this requires cardinality. You require cardinal variables to smooth, to average across people. And that's not the case we have with sanitation or water or electricity. So it's not surprising that M0 measure does not satisfy this. You could use M1 if you had all cardinal variables. But it's not a limitation of the measure, it's a limitation of the data we use. That's the reason we use M0. Now there is another kind of distributional property, which is the rearrangement among the poor, which is, rather than requiring averaging achievements, it entails switching achievements between two poor people. So an association decreasing rearrangement occurs when there is a switch between these two poor people in such a way that, in simple terms, actually there was one person who was poorer than the other one, and after the switch, that no longer holds. Well, this property doesn't conflict with ordinality because it's a switch, not an averaging. And it's worth remarking that the MPI satisfies this in a weak form, in the sense that M0 doesn't change under this kind of rearrangement. Now, if you want that to work in a strong form, you want poverty to decrease, for example, then you need to add a couple more things. And you arrive to dimensional transfer principle, which is a variant of rearrangement that requires that the switch involves deprived achievements. So that, because we are looking at measures that satisfy deprivation focus. And so in that way, you can have a strong form of the axiom that will require poverty to decrease under an association decreasing rearrangement among the poor. Well, M0 does not satisfy this kind of strong axiom. But let me also say this axiom was proposed by Sabina and James in the 2016 and 2019 paper. And in those papers, they also show that this property is simply incompatible with dimensional breakdown. Let me just make one more remark, which is also made in the paper, which is, here we talked about weakened versus strong versions in terms of poverty measure not changing or changing under a transformation. But this could also be in another sense, which is, until now, we have been talking about changings that do not modify the number of the poor. And that has been done on purpose. Why? Well, think of the converse case in which, for example, there is an association increasing rearrangement by which, after the switch, a person stops being poor. And so you could arrive to a controversial case in which the number of the poor could be reduced at the expense of an increase in inequality. And we will be returning to that in a minute. So, okay, MPI has these problems that it doesn't satisfy a strong version of the rearrangement property, and there have been two proposals to enlarge the MPI in order to incorporate inequality. One of them, one route, we will call it the complementary approach, and has been proposed by Schumann, Seth, and Sabina, and it proposes to complement M0, in this case the MPI, with a well-known measure, the variance of deprivation scores among the poor. We all know the variance. In this case, it's worth noting that the mean of that distribution, because it is among the poor, is poverty intensity, A. This is an absolute inequality measure, which means absolute inequality measures are invariant to changing achievements in the same amount. So if you add something or subtract something to all deprivation scores, the variance doesn't change, and that is called the translation invariance property. But it also means that the level of inequality increases with the mean of the distribution. Absolute inequality measures opposed to relative inequality measures, which are invariant to changes in achievements by the same proportion, not the same amount. So if you multiply them by the same scalar, then the inequality measure doesn't change. And that is called scaling variance. Relative measures are independent of the mean, and income inequality measures in general are, we want them to be to be of the type of relative inequality measures. The other proposed route has been what we will call the assimilated approach. Actually, Stuhlman and Sabina put that name of assimilated approach. And this has been the proposal by Sabina and James in the 2016 and 2019 paper, which is the MGamma class of poverty measures, which was actually anticipated in the 2011 paper at the end. And so here is the formula, is the average of the censored deprivation scores to the power gamma. Note that when gamma equals 0, this is simply the incidence of multidimensional poverty. When gamma equals 1 is incidence adjusted by intensity, that is M0. And when gamma equals 2, you've got the square count measure, which is sensitive to inequality. M0 gamma 2 is related to the squared coefficient of variation, which in turn is related to the variance because it's simply the variance divided by a square, the mean squared. So the advantage of the M0 gamma 2 measure is that it summarizes the 3 I's of poverty: incidence, intensity, and inequality. The disadvantage is that, as we know, distribution sensitivity is incompatible with dimensional breakdown, although I must say that it allows a form of restricted dimensional breakdown using Shapley breakdown, but it's a bit less intuitive than the usual breakdown I have just shown. So let me show just a couple of examples with the same example I was looking at in a sort of provocative way. If we start with the same distribution we were looking initially, now we have added the column of the square, the count and square vector, which is simply the CI squared. And so we are adding the M0 gamma 2 measure, in this case is 0.291, and the variance among the poor. What happens if there is an association increase in rearrangement, and so that this fourth person switches with the third person who is poorer? So now say the third person has had a car and gave it to the fourth person, and so now she's also deprived in assets, and now the fourth person is no longer deprived in assets. Well, we see that HA and M0 do not change, satisfy with rearrangement. Now they don't change. They don't show, M0 doesn't show any change. Whereas M0 gamma 2 increases because inequality has increased and the variance among the poor has also increased. Here the number of the poor hasn't changed. Now let's look at a more provocative example by which suppose that the number of the poor is reduced as a consequence of an association increasing rearrangement. Let's suppose that rather than changing assets, they change nutritional levels. There is some transfer in food that makes the third person become undernourished and the fourth one stop being undernourished. It's obviously this is a very strong example. It's provocative, okay? And so now the number, this switch has made this fourth person stop being poor because now her deprivation score is below 33%. And so incidence has decreased, intensity has increased because the intensity is now divided over a smaller number. M0 has decreased because the decrease in incidence dominates. However, the M0 gamma 2 measure, as well as the variance among the poor, increases, reflecting this increase in inequality. So these are the things that clearly have motivated the critiques to the MPI and things that may make people uncomfortable. Let me just make a parenthesis and show that the M-gamma class can be nicely represented in a graph, which is a sort of analogy to Jenkins and Lambert tip curve. We could have two distributions, distribution A and B. here ordered from richest to poorest. And in distribution A, everyone has the same deprivation score, whereas in distribution B, they are much more unequal. Two people are just have the minimum deprivation score, whereas the other two have the maximum deprivation score. And you can accumulate the population and accumulate the average deprivation score. And so the nice thing in this graph is that you see that here you see the headcount ratio, half of the population in both distributions are poor. When you finish accumulating the deprivation, the average deprivation score, you arrive to M0, which is the same, is 0.33 in both distributions. But the curvature tells you inequality, and you see that A is a more equal distribution than B. So that's a nice representation with that summarizes a lot of information in a graph. And this is with a real example between Pakistan and Timor-Leste, but the same kind of graph. Okay, but now let's go to the meat of the presentation, which is what does evidence tell us about inequality among the poor? And I must say that although originally we had 107 countries, we ended up with 89 because countries with a very small number of poor people cannot have a reliable estimate of variance among the poor. And so that reduced the number of countries. I need to acknowledge the incredible work of the OPHI team, because all this has been done with the estimates of the 2020 MPI Global MPI report, and the team led by Usha and Nikolai and all these people mentioned here. And so I need to acknowledge that. Let me show you just one first graph. This is a graph that ranks countries just by inequality among the poor, just by inequality among the poor. The red bars are the variance among the poor. The green line is the squared coefficient of variation among the poor, among deprivation scores, no? In deprivation scores among the poor. Well, we see that selecting an absolute or a relative measure changes the ranking of countries quite significantly. For example, Paraguay. Paraguay ranks 40 in terms of variance among the poor and ranks 69 in terms of the square coefficient of variation. And all the countries in red have very significant changes in the rank order by one measure or the other. At the same time, you've got the countries in green, which also change, but in the other way. Niger ranks 85 in terms of variance and 42 in terms of square coefficient of variation. Why is that? Well, it has to do with translation invariance versus scale invariance. The variance increases with intensity, and these countries, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on, have very high intensities, and so they are penalized by the variance. Whereas with the square coefficient of variation, they are not. Is this good or bad? Well, it's debatable. What is clear is that it's not trivial, the selection. We may think that maybe it's not that counterintuitive to rank countries with higher poverty intensity in a worse position, because deprivations, as opposed to income, deprivations are a bad and not a good, and so higher poverty intensity is a bad, is a worse situation. So reflecting higher variance intuitively refers that they are less preferred. At the same time, you may want to just separate the two things, intensity and pure distributional issues. Another point a bit in favor of the variance is that the variance is invariant to looking at either deprivations or achievements. As you can imagine, achievements are the complement of deprivations. It's just one minus deprivations. And so again, because of the scale invariance versus translation invariance property, the variance is indifferent to computing inequality over the deprivation scores or over the achievements scores. Whereas the square coefficient of variation does change because it's not invariant to adding or subtracting things. Okay, so those are just two notes to have in mind. Now, up to now, I have just looked at rankings of inequality. Now let's see how inequality behaves alongside intensity, alongside the mean of the distribution of the deprivation scores. On the left, we have the graph of the variance against poverty intensity A. On the right, we have the square coefficient of variation against intensity. The shape of each graph has to do with the definition, it's almost by definition of the inequality measure. As we were saying, the variance increases with intensity, with the mean, whereas the square coefficient of variation has an inverted U shape. Now, in both cases, we find pairs of countries with similar intensities, but very different inequality levels. And when I say very different, I mean statistically significantly different. So Vietnam and South Africa have the same poverty intensity, but Vietnam has almost 3 times inequality as South Africa. Morocco and Congo, same intensity, but Morocco has 1.3 times inequality, both as measured by variance or by square coefficient of variation as Congo. Same thing with Mali and Nigeria. So we start seeing that there can be differences among the different eyes of poverty. Now, what if we look at MPI, which is incidence adjusted by intensity? Obviously, the form of the graph is the same, almost the same, because A is a component of MPI. The dots are a bit more dispersed because here we also are incorporating incidence. Again, we find pairs of countries which have not significantly different MPIs, but significantly different inequality levels, either as measured by variance or by square coefficient of variation. The pairs of countries are different because now we are looking at MPI. So it's Egypt and Vietnam, Timor-Leste and Pakistan, Mali and Benin, just to mention some examples. Okay, so looking at this, one may say, oh, okay, then this is serious. We need to move away from MPI because it doesn't incorporate inequality. You can have same MPI, but very different inequality. And so we can ask, okay, but how frequent are these cases to find similar MPIs, but very different inequality among the poor? And to look at that, what we did was to look at pairwise comparisons. First, we computed the number of significant pairwise comparisons of the global MPI, simply that, to look at, well, in which pairs we see that one country is statistically significantly poorer than another. Then we said, okay, let's look at another measure, for example, M0 gamma 2, or the variance among the poor. Do that and then compare across pairs of measures and see whether those pairwise comparisons are robust to different measures. So a pairwise country comparison is robust if countries P and R have the same significant relationship, one being poorer than the other, across different measures. What do we find? Actually, we find a very high coincidence. We find, we also did between just headcount ratio and MPI, the multidimensional headcount ratio and the incidence times intensity, and 94% of total possible pairwise comparisons have a robust relationship across those two measures. Let me say that we have 89 countries, so there are 3,916 possible pairwise comparisons, of which 95% are significant in terms of MPI only. And then we moved to comparing across measures. What if we compare MPI and M0 gamma 2? Well, we find that 95% of total possible pairwise comparisons are robust. And if we do that as a proportion of the significant MPI pairwise comparisons, that is virtually 100%, virtually all. When we do MPI with variance among the poor, the proportion is lower, but that's not surprise because M0 gamma 2 has incidence, intensity, and inequality, whereas here we are comparing MPI with a pure inequality measure among the poor. So it's expectable that coincidence will be a bit lower. Still, it's quite high if you think it's 87% of all G-MPI pairwise, significant pairwise comparisons are robust to looking at variance among the poor. So the answer is that it's not very frequent to find similar MPI values and very different inequality levels. It seems that inequality among the poor, quite sadly, tends to go quite hand in hand with poverty incidence and poverty intensity. One may say, wait, isn't that the same story as when moving from H to M0? Well, in terms of change of rankings and pairwise comparisons, yeah, it's quite similar. But the thing is that when you move from pure incidence to incidence adjusted by intensity, it's sort of a win-win case because the measure becomes sensitive to poverty intensity and it incorporates the possibility of dimensional breakdown, which you can't do with H. And this is quite relevant for policy design. And the measure doesn't lose interpretative intuition. Whereas when you want to make it sensitive to inequality, it has a cost, which is losing dimensional breakdown. Although, as I said, you can depict it nicely in the curve I showed. This is another way to compare the two moves. When you move from H to M0, this is a representation. The black bubbles, the size of the bubble is the number of poor people in each country. The black bubbles are the actual MPI estimates. The gray bubbles are what would be the MPI if in the countries there was an intensity of 100%. So that would be in the diagonal. Fortunately, all countries are pulled down because no country has a 100% intensity of poverty. Now, if we want an analogy with that, in moving from M0 to M02, the black bubbles are M02, the actual M0 gamma 2 estimates, and the gray bubbles would be what would be the M0 gamma 2 measure if there was zero inequality among the poor, in which case M0 gamma 2 will be H times A squared. And of course, this is influenced by the squaring process, but you can see that the change in moving from this to this seems quite bigger than the change in incorporating inequality. In any case, in both cases, the rankings of countries are very much preserved. Let me show you another piece of evidence, which is looking at inequality among the poor in a summary measure alongside looking at the distribution of deprivation scores. And let me show you an example precisely of those in which MPI is similar, but the inequality among the poor is statistically different. This is an example, Mali and Benin. This is the Lorenz curve for the poor in achievements, and so we see that Mali has lower inequality than Benin. But when we look at these pie charts that are reported by OPHI in every country profile, actually they don't look terribly different, no? What we do see is that in the categories of highest intensity, Benin has a bit higher shares, 1 percentage point higher share in each of these poorest and most intense categories, and a bit higher share in the least intense. But aside from that, it seems that both countries have significant fractions of the population with very high poverty intensities clearly left behind. And here we can see how much it adds to be able to look at the decomposition, the dimensional breakdown, because we can see here that Mali has much higher deprivation levels in school attendance and housing, but much lower deprivations in sanitation, electricity, and assets. We could look at another example, for example, Timor-Leste and Pakistan. In this case, MPIs are similar, A's are not. Pakistan has a higher poverty intensity, but again, which can be seen in the sense that Timor-Leste has a higher fraction of the poor in the least intense categories, whereas Pakistan has a lower number there. But if you look at the shares of the in the categories of the most intensely poor, they are quite similar. So it would be a bit misleading to conclude that then Timor-Leste is in a much better position just because it has lower inequality. I mean, there are significant groups left behind. And again, when we look at the composition of poverty, we see that Timor-Leste has much higher incidence of deprivations in living standard indicators, whereas Pakistan in education. Let me say just one more piece of evidence and I conclude. We can also ask about what is the relationship between inequality among the poor and the destitutes. The destitute, as defined in the OPHI reports, is a more stringent version of the global MPI. It is not defined in terms of higher poverty intensity, but in terms of more severe deprivations in the considered indicators, more graver deprivations. Yet one could expect some link between inequality among the poor and the incidence of destitute, because one could think that if there is higher inequality among the poor, then I mean, people with graver deprivations in certain indicators, it is likely that they would also have higher poverty intensity. When we do just a scatter plot between variance or square coefficient of variation among the poor and the incidence of destitution, we see a positive relationship, slightly not that strong. When we run OLS, obviously this does not imply causality by no means, it's just looking at correlations. We see a positive coefficient both for variance and square coefficient of variation, but when we control for incidence and intensity, either separated or together in the G-MPI, it's interesting to see that the inequality coefficient becomes negative. So it suggests that higher inequality, when you control for incidence and intensity, is associated with lower incidence of destitution. So that is also a result to think about. So let me just conclude. Perhaps I have more questions than answers, but clearly inequality among the poor matters because it matters that the poorest poor are not left behind, and that is relevant for policy, as I said at the beginning. We find that country rankings by absolute versus relative poverty, when you only look at that aspect of poverty, matters when you use one kind of measure or the other. But when you look at everything together and look at incidence, intensity, and inequality, what you find is that country rankings by the G-MPI actually are quite robust to incorporating inequality. In other words, that things seem to go together: incidence, intensity, and inequality. This does not mean that it doesn't matter to know and measure inequality among the poor, by no means. But it does suggest some things. First, substituting the global MPI by a distributional sensitive poverty measure, I do not see it as it has been suggested by some people outside OPHI. It doesn't seem very recommendable because the costs in terms of losing dimensional breakdown, to me, far outweighed the benefits. Now, complementing it, yes, that is helpful. But inevitably, it seems that any summary inequality measure will need to be analyzed and considered together with the distribution of the deprivation scores alongside the dimensional breakdown, as well as the incidence of destitution, to really be able to design specific policies, interconnected sectorial policies, in order to leave no one behind. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mariema. That was amazingly efficient, filled with all kinds of details, which I hope that many in the audience have been able to grasp the way that you've incorporated inequality and seen whether it's robust after incorporation, whether the MPI might be actually telling a good part of the story already, and it seems to be doing so. At this moment, let me remind the audience that your questions will be accepted, and we look forward to seeing them. Put them into the question and answer Q&A section, please, in your WebEx. And now let me turn it over to Heriberto Tapia for a first discussion.
Thank you, James. Congratulations, Maria, Emma, and Sabina for the paper. Very interesting. It says illuminating, and it is very illuminating. So another headline it could be that the MPI is very good. Is too good to be challenged by other measures. So, but I'm gonna center my comments around the ideas how we can use inequality measures to capture this concept of leaving no one behind. So inequalities beyond income are difficult. So even for income, it is becoming a very complex concept because to measure, in spite of having a standard methodology experience, but if we ask what has happened with income inequality over the last 10 years, there are different answers. When we move to multidimensional poverty, we have two types of problems. So we are having more variables, but also the nature of the variables is very different. So in particular, these 0-1 characteristics of the variables makes things qualitatively very different. So in the analysis of inequality when taking, let's say, one dimension, typically what has been described is that there is like a construction, a Kuznets curve, which is built in. So in a way, the intuition is that in order to have a very good outcome, all have to perform well, and in order to have a very bad outcome, all have to perform bad. So in the extreme, inequalities are low, and then in the middle, there is a space for inequality. So it's some sort of, it's actually an upper bound for inequality. So in this case, which is more complex because we have more variables, we have some of that appears, I think, very clearly in the analysis. The part of the corners curve that is more linked to bad outcomes is harder to see because the intensity is not as high in practice. But the other section is I think, very clear. And to me, this is what is a strong variable behind this strong connection between inequality and outcomes. So here, I think in the literature, in general, there are two ways to see these connections. So one way to see this connection is that, well, given that there is this structural connection, so let's focus on what is not structural and to see the differences, and so that's one way to go. Another way to go is to just accept it as face value and say, well, these two things go together. So let's say in the context of the agenda for sustainable development, reducing inequalities in human development, let's say, is a necessary condition to make progress on the average measure. And I think this paper goes along this way, although it would be interesting to see if the analytic result of the upper bound could be stated as well, because it is, I think, present. So, and then once the results are reached, then there is the comparison with the MPI. And so the question that is asked is, well, how much we learn from this summary inequality measure as opposed to analyzing the distribution of poverty intensity? And yeah, the result is that in general, the informational content of the MPI machinery is huge. And this is not, I think, a weakness of the inequality measures that are proposed. It's a strength of the way the MPI is constructed with all these different elements. Here we are not comparing, like in other cases, just a measure of inequality with a measure of the average outcome. We have also the intensity component that is explicit, and also we have the possibility of running group decomposability and also multidimensional breakdown. So I think it's a tough test for the inequality measures, and to me this is the main highlight of the paper. So that even though a measure might not have the traditionally desired properties of inequality measure, but it still be very good and very solid. However, I think in order to strengthen this analysis, it would be good to see what happens with some of the things that we know that the MPI might not be doing. So cases where the properties, these desired properties of inequality measures matter. So cases where we can identify eventually pockets of poverty that we cannot see just by looking at intensity. To me, that it would be good to have an idea of how that can be integrated and justify the use of an inequality measure in those particular cases. So, now what can be done in addition to this? So if the focus is to capture leaving no one behind, those who are left behind. So I think there are two ways to go. One is to look beyond the extreme poor. So there are two problems that somehow, or issues that somehow are discussed, but probably are deserve a little bit more of analysis that are associated with this measure. One is that somehow the relationship between inequality and the overall situation of the population might have some funny characteristics. So, for instance, it might be the case, and this was one of the examples, that in some places, some people leave poverty, and therefore, what happens with the dispersion of the one who remain poor? So, understanding this relationship. And as a matter of fact, in the cases of Vietnam and South Africa, that they have the same intensity and very different of inequalities, actually the level of the country with the higher inequality, the country with the higher inequality also have the lower headcount. So we don't know exactly whether we can say that one is better off than the other based on these indicators. The second problem, I think it was already dealt with, which is the issue of the variability within countries with low poverty. So the bottom line here is that the fact that we are computing inequality in a sample is making things more complicated. So my suggestion is why you don't try to analyze inequality not only for the poor, but for the entire population, because that by design would be giving you information that is complementary to what is not being captured by the MPI. So I would be interested in knowing first why you didn't do it, and whether this is something that you consider. And the other point, and this is my final point, is also going beyond extreme poverty in a more qualitative sense. Because when we see these results and we see this strong relationship, all things go together, basically this is indicating that as countries develop, inequality goes down. So in the bigger context of inequality, where people are complaining about equality, they feel that inequality is a problem. This picture, in a way, reflects only one part of what is happening. So that's why what we did a couple of years ago is to try to expand the number of variables that we were looking at, to say, for instance, what's happening with the access to internet. And in that case, we can see that while some variables are some inequalities is going down in some variables reflecting extreme deprivation, inequality is going up at the same time in other variables. And access to internet is something that is not like a luxury anymore. It's something essential. So it would. So this is what I'm trying to say, that it would be good to open also the view towards this new variable, or at least acknowledge that this is an important component of the full picture. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting discussion. I particularly like the idea of new variables rolling in. Of course, this is difficult to do across all countries, but it is important to conceptually introduce the new rounds of the kinds of variables that are becoming more important, and understanding their impact on previous results, in particular, since they're unequally distributed and can be more unequally distributed than the previous ones, they can have a really big impact in that dimension. Now, let me turn it over to Hector Moreno.
Thanks, James. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to give comments on this very nice paper. Emma said something that I like a lot about the family of poverty measures that we are discussing, in the sense that it includes the 3 I's: innovative, interesting, and important incidence, intensity, and inequality. But I would say that the paper has the 3 I's also too, which is innovative, interesting, and the importance of a topic. So let me share the screen. Follow this presentation. Well, first, there is a wider understanding, acknowledging that the inequalities are multidimensional, and this is something that I like about the paper. There are more and more evidence that how these inequalities are interacting, and these are driving very important differences in groups of population. There is a recent paper by Chetty and Kotler about how inequality in health is associated by inequality in other economic indicators. In their paper, they examined life expectancy and mortality, which is some of the indicators contained in the Global Mpi. So they found evidence for the USA, but there is no there is no way we can think this can be found elsewhere. So it's a very important topic. But contrasting with this, acknowledging there is little evidence, and precisely because we don't have the machinery, perhaps, yet fully developed on how to integrate distributions into one measure. And I think this is one of the main attributes of this paper. So what does the paper do? Well, it examines the inequality of this joint distribution of deprivations, and I think this is one of the main contributions of the paper. The paper follows an empirical approach to answer a very, I think, to me, a very interesting research question, which is how the inequality among the poor can complement the information of the Global Mpi. And very interestingly, the paper employs 2 approaches. This is just to very briefly describe the paper. The first one is the complementary approach by using the variance among the poor, a very well-known and used inequality indicator. And the second approach is what they say, it's an assimilated approach. I could have called it a uniform approach that integrates all these 3 I's that I mentioned at the beginning. So while reading the book of Inequality of Atkinson, he said, well, when you think about inequality, you have to think about several questions. Inequality with respect to what? Inequality of what, of course, and inequality among whom? But these are just a few questions. And let me, these are not all, but just a few questions. So I'm going to use the measure that the paper uses, the first approach. which is, I'm not going to use the second approach because Emma very clearly mentioned the association between these two. So it's this for exemplification is going to be useful. So what the paper does, it links or it uses basic capabilities contained in the Global MPI, health, education, and living standard indicators. When it turns to inequality of among whom, it's if we focus on Q, we know that we are focusing on the poor, and then you see the A is the mean deprivation. So it's in this case we're talking about an index where we are comparing with respect to the mean. Now, how do we integrate? This is another interesting topic. In this case, it's inequality using the variance and the MGamma family that we discussed with Emma. So the paper, I think, improves our understanding of multidimensional phenomena, in particular, the joint distribution of deprivations. Very importantly, the paper points out that the cross-sectional variation with cross-sectional variation, the paper shows that inequality among the poor runs in parallel with the incidence and with the intensity. This is something that it's being shown empirically. This is going to be extremely useful to understand the nature of anti-poverty interventions. And let me then just simply move to some points that I find interesting. So this is a very nice figure that shows the global MPI for regions, and then the inequality of these two measures. There is a rank change. If you see South Asia with respect to the coefficient of variation, should be placed in the 3rd place. And similarly, the Arab states changed the ranking. This, of course, happens at the very aggregate level. But these are the difference in point estimates. So if you see the value of these inequality measures is 0.05 or 0.055. So the first thing that comes to my mind is how can we express this in terms of confidence intervals? Because of course we are using survey data, so I think we can explore this further, and I'm sure that this is being explored, or it's going to be explored in the next stages of the paper. The same thing occurred when I see this graph. In this graph, we have on the vertical axis the variance of the deprivation against A, or against MPI. This is the same graph more or less, but in both cases, you can see that the range is very, very small, from 0.035 to 0.005. But you see that there is a very small variation. So I wonder if these numbers are statistically significantly different from 0. And of course, the paper does some interesting procedures to deal with this and to try to understand what's going on. And then, again, with this idea, it was very interesting for me to see that when we compare or we observe the scatter plot of these measures against A or MPI, we observe a nonlinear relationship. And then when they do this OLS regression with a more intense measure of poverty, which is destitution, they found a negative sign. And I wonder maybe if you could consider either stratifying the sample of countries, given that in this part that appears in the square in the graph, we have very few observations. I don't know if that's something that is systematical, or that's something that we can consider robust in that sense, or at least in that part. And in the regression, this would mean probably that maybe you need to include a higher order term, for instance, A2. So I wonder if results would remain being statistically significant in this part, given that we have either few observations, we know that the relationship is not linear, and that perhaps we are missing some higher order terms. Just to conclude, so let me go back to this original diagram that I used at the beginning to add a few comments. So when we talk about inequality among whom, I again join this comment about why not using the full set of countries, and moreover, the full joint distribution of achievements or deprivation. I think that would be interesting. I understand that this is not the focus of this paper, and that's fine, but I think this could be at least a line of future research. So I'm not criticizing the paper for not doing it, because I understand that the paper has a different purpose, at least at this stage. The second thing is that what about consider other supplementary measures, for instance, the tail index. Again, this is not the scope of the paper, but it's something that I'm thinking maybe could be explored in the future, not by Sabina or Emma, but by someone else. And the possibility of report bootstrapped standard errors. Another topic that I think it's interesting, it's adding other capabilities, dimensions, indicators. This is something that could be performed with national MPIs that are exploring different alternatives. And finally, well, not finally, but another topic that is interesting for me, it's what about using different A? So here A is AI, which is the mean of each country. But what about using the average of different countries or different regions, as they used in the first graph that I showed by continents, for instance? Something that is also interesting to me is how does this measure, these inequality measures, varies with different case poverty cutoffs or with different number of indicators. This is something to be tested empirically. And finally, what I liked about this paper is that it helps you to think a lot of many things. But one of the things that I always thought it's been underexploited is the distribution of these CIs. And I like the idea that this paper is exploiting it, and in a way it's inviting people to realize about this fact and trying to explore different avenues of future research for this. So I think that would be it. I will finish here. I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Hector. That's a very nice discussion with a nice framing element with Tony Atkinson's way of looking at stuff. In particular, each time that you're mentioning something, it seems to be something that could be useful to explore. So I do encourage those in the audience to take the advice well. Now, I wanted to turn it back to Mariama for response to the discussants, but please, those of you who are in the audience, please feel free to write down a couple of questions in the meanwhile. Mariama.
Thank you very much, Heriberto and Hector. I don't have much to respond, only to say thanks. And definitely, you're right. We should also compare inequality among the holders in deprivation scores without censoring. I think that's for sure the next step we should look at, as well as all the other suggestions. But that's a very obvious one that honestly I hadn't thought of at the beginning. So thank you very much for all the suggestions. I have taken notes and will pursue them.
Great. So seeing no questions, I'll have a few myself, if you don't mind. First of all, you have a result that seems to link up or not link up, if you will, destitution and inequality. Usually when you deal with income inequality and destitution, there actually is some expected relationship going on. So those outliers at the lower end are quite important. Could it be that, could you go back through the definition of destitution and explain to us why you think there's not such a close relationship between the two. I'm just kind of curious that it goes backwards in your results. Maybe it has something to do with the definition of destitution.
Destitutes are defined in terms of being below a low deprivation cutoff in certain indicators. So they are, for example, even more to the left of the nutritional distribution. So that is the result that higher inequality, controlling for incidence and intensity, could lead to lower destitution. I mean, my first thought is that the distribution starts moving, and some people that, I mean, it is a very provocative result, because it may be that there might be regressive transfers between the poor that make some people move out of destitution. And so that could be, I'm not sure, but it would be suggesting something like that. But I'm not totally sure. I think it is something worth exploring. But I thought very much when I found that, in terms of thinking through the final remarks you were doing in the paper when you were saying that the role of inequality in poverty measurement has a contingent priority. And so I think it is related to that.
Yes, in fact, I was also thinking that if you defined extreme only in terms of additional numbers of previously cut off, if you will, deprivation levels. So you didn't change the level of each cutoff per indicator, but instead went only in the depth in terms of breadth now, then perhaps the two would be much, much more closely linked. That's all what I'm thinking, is that because you've changed the very nature of the distribution in a way that the inequality measure itself is not capturing, it doesn't measure additional depth like destitution does, then perhaps it's expected. And so one should look, I think, follow through a little bit in that direction to understand the lack of a link between the two. So let me go on to ask a question from Samuel McQuillan. Goes on to say, thank you very much for your discussion. Do you have any indication whether national or deprivation specific MPIs follow this trend as well? Do you have any reason to believe that MPIs of different scopes would have different results regarding inequality? So by different scopes, I'm assuming primarily the national with different indicators, different priorities. Any sense at all in terms of national MPIs, folks?
I wouldn't dare to guess. I would prefer to look at the numbers. Yeah, I don't know, because global MPI is a measure of acute poverty. So we are looking at very extreme deprivations in a way, whereas national MPIs look at less, actually more demanding thresholds, and so a second layer of poverty in a way. At the moment, I wouldn't like to guess.
So just to go on with another question, I noticed that in your presentation, you didn't do any breakdowns for the MGamma measure for gamma equals 2. And notice that to bring home the point entirely, if you presented the breakdowns, which would include actually the component within breakdown a la Shapley, a bit more confusing, a bit, not as straightforward. But still, the breakdown itself, you'd probably find that it's very similar to the original breakdown with some small deviations away from it, and therefore bring home the point that inequality is relevant. Perhaps in some particular cases, it could be very relevant, but in the broad scheme of things, it's really important to focus on the core measure, which is M0. What do you think? And could you elaborate why that wasn't part of the discussion here?
No, it wasn't just a matter of time, but definitely, I think after concluding the presentation, I thought what we need to add here is just alongside those bars where we were looking at the usual decomposition, we should add the Shapley decomposition of M and gamma 2, which is just the weighted sum of the M zeros by dimension. So it would be very nice to compare those. And if they deliver the same message, then perhaps we are being too strong about favoring the MPI and not maybe easing it a little bit, and why not moving to MGamma 2?
Yes, indeed. So thank you. Thanks for your response. Now, do we have any other questions from the audience? I see not. I mean, you've done such an exceptional job, Mariama, of explaining everything that it appears that everyone has a great concept of what you've talked about. I can't carry on the conversation forever here, so instead I'll turn it over to my colleague, Sabina Alkire, to ask a question of her colleague, Emma Santos.
No, thank you so much, James. Going back to Heriberto's observation or question about doing an inequality measure with the uncensored distribution, that of course will include false positives for example, in the case of cooking fuel. And so I wonder two things. One would be perhaps using a restricted set of K cutoffs, like 20% and above. And the second would be, now that we have trend data over time, we can compare using cross-sectional data, not longitudinal data, of course, two countries, the intensity and the distribution of intensity scores, or the distribution of the CI vector over time. And I wonder if that would be another way of getting at how it could have changed and how Pakistan and whatever, East Timor would be different. So those were two things that occurred to me that we might chat about later.
Would you like to have a quick response, Mariama?
Oh, yeah, I definitely, I agree. And it's just
to be provocative then.
We need to keep on going.
Just to be provocative then, I mean, if we have something that has false positives in cooking fuel and the data are just really edgy on the edge, I mean, they don't seem to be capturing it for people, doesn't that make it problematic across the board? And I mean, you have to believe in your data in order to be measuring poverty and inequality also. So it would seem to me that you should probably look at the distribution of all the elements that you have and the numbers that you obtain to see what's going on in inequality overall in the reported variables that you have. If you are indeed interested in inequality, that's a relevant thing. So I'm wondering how you deal with the fact that, I mean, is it that you don't trust the data so well, or what's going on in terms of these false positives? Could that be elaborated on? And in terms of measuring things like inequality, which of course want to get the entire distribution across the board at the end of the day, if you're focusing on inequality primarily. And many people are.
Oh, definitely. I think we should do the full range of exercises, just like when we do the estimates for the full K range for the different weights. And so same thing here. It doesn't hurt to look at the inequality of the completely uncensored distribution. If we were to find something really completely different, well, that's a signal to investigate further, and we could see where that come from, and really if it is introducing a K value, a higher K value, what is the reason that is changing or producing more stable results in terms of inequality vis-a-vis intensity and incidence. And that would be a result in itself, of course.
Well, thank you so much for responding to my questions. Emma Santos. Thanks to our discussants for being here and to everyone who's been in the audience. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I look forward to seeing you again next week looking at multidimensional poverty. Take care. Bye-bye now.